Good morning, everyone. It's good to be back with you again. It's hard to believe that we haven't been together now for close to 6 to 7 weeks, I guess. The last time, I believe, was on March 16th, and we're already at the beginning of May. Hopefully, by the end of the summer, we can start to gather again, but we're going to take it safe and make sure that we protect the vulnerable and those that could have a real issue if they did catch COVID. So this morning, in the scripture reading from Peter this morning, he ends his piece by saying, "For you were like sheep going astray, but now you will return to the shepherd and overseer of your souls." Peter telling those who were listening to him that they were like sheep. And not only this, but they were like sheep that may have been going astray. He then says to them, "But now you have returned to the shepherd." And why did they return? Because of the life-giving message of Christ and how Christ lived the message that he shared. Christ lived the message, offering a template for their living. Peter writes, "To this you were called because Christ suffered for you, leaving you an example that you should follow in his steps." And the scripture reading from John is directed to the Pharisees. The Pharisees were members of a religious party that flourished in Palestine from 515 BCE until about 70 CE. They insisted on the binding force of oral tradition, or the unwritten Torah. They were actually quite a progressive group in their time. They looked more toward the spirit of the law than the actual law found in the Torah. But as we read in Scripture, they challenged Jesus on many occasions. In this Scripture, Jesus is talking directly to them, and by extension, I believe, to anyone who claims to be in ministry today. To us, Jesus is saying that anyone who shares anything but the message of Christ, or the message being one of love, compassion, tolerance, justice, and inclusiveness, is like a thief. They're a bit of a phony. There is a whole message in this alone, but today I want to look at something else in this scripture that might teach us a little something. In the metaphor Jesus uses, we are seen as sheep. Jesus is the gate, or can we say the message and life of Christ is the gate. John attributes these words to Jesus. "I am the gate. Whoever enters through me will be saved. They will come in and go out and find pasture. The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." And one of the interesting things here is that Jesus says they will come in and out and find pasture. There is a sense that they will leave that safe space. And when we leave that space with Christ, we will find pasture. If the pasture was right outside the pen, we would not have to find it because we would already know where it is. I cannot help but wonder if Jesus is talking about a journey through life itself, and not just a moment during our lives. We start off with God in that safe space that is gated and protected. We leave the safe space and journey through life looking for pasture, a place of peace, a place of contentment, a place where we can find meaning and purpose. And we return to God, the safe space. Along that journey, there will be so much that might lead us down different paths, might lead us in the wrong direction, astray, as Peter says, thieves in the night, as Jesus describes. But with Christ, when we are attentive to his message, when we look at his life, we will find our way back to the trail, the journey from the pen to the pasture. For me, as I have said so many times before, the message of Jesus comes to life when I can relate to them through a lived experience. For some reason, they all become very real when I think of a journey that I have been on. So the story I'm sharing with you today is a particular journey that was taken in the winter of 2012, and it was on a winter road that begins outside of Lynn Lake, Manitoba, and ends at Tadoule Lake, Manitoba, both First Nations communities. I was approached by the management at Big Freight and asked if I would consider doing a trip on my own from Steinbach, Manitoba to Tuduli Lake, Manitoba. Tuduli Lake is a fly-in community that is about 694 kilometers north of Thompson, Manitoba, with the last 370 kilometers on a winter road. It was a common practice for a trip that has this long a winter road section to have at least two drivers run together, but since there was not enough freight to move, they could only send me. It was a new school bus that needed to be delivered and an old one brought back on a drop-deck trailer. I agreed to take this trip, even though I was quite apprehensive about going alone. My plan was to load and drive as far as Thompson on my first day, and on my second day I would drive to the little community of Lynn Lake, Manitoba, fuel up and make sure everything was ready, and I would begin the winter road section and sleep at a check station at kilometer 160 at the Lac Brochet turnoff. My third day was from the turnoff at Lac Brochet to Tuduli Lake. And there I'd unload my bus and reload the old one and return to the Lac Brochet turnoff. My fourth day would be from the turnoff back to Thompson, and my fifth day back to Steinbach. It was a Wednesday during the last week in February 2012. The day began clear and it was cold in Steinbach. I loaded the new bus on a drop-deck trailer and secured it using twice the number of chains that were required by law because I knew that the road was going to be very rough. I then went to the garage and loaded up with everything I could think of that I might need: oil and antifreeze, safety brake, diesel fuel conditioner, some spare parts, pieces of airline, etc. I then made sure I had enough food and water and warm clothes to last me a few extra days in case something unforeseen happened. I was doing my final safety check in the yard when a familiar face appeared out of the driver's room. It was a gentleman named Farley. Farley was a well-respected winter road veteran. He walked up to me and said, "I understand, Ed, that you are taking a trip to Tuduli Lake on your own." And I replied that yes, I was. And he said, "Can I talk to you a bit before you leave?" We jumped into the cab of my truck and he said, You mind if I offer some advice?" I knew Farley and I respected his experience, so I sat back and I listened. He started, "Ed, I know that we often talk about not using chains onto winter roads unless you need to on a steep grade, but you're going by yourself." He said, "Chain up at the entrance to the Tuduli Lake Road and leave them on until you get out. Stay below the speed limit, which is 20 kilometers an hour. He said there are many sharp curves and short ice bridge crossings." He reminded me that if I went off the road, help could be a long time coming. Then he asked, "Are you going to spend the night at the Lac Brochet cutoff?" And I replied that I was. And he said it can be very cold in this part of the world. He says, "When you stop for the night, do not put your parking brake on." He said the brake linings will freeze to the drums, then it can become near impossible to release your parking brake without a torch. He said, "Chalk your wheels with a tree limb or a rock." And he said, "When you wake up, make some noise before you get out of the truck." He told me that wildlife up there do not see much equipment and could be attracted to the heat from your motor and try to sleep under your truck. And then he said, "There is one place I want you to pay particular attention to." He said, "About 60 kilometers past the Lac Brochet turnoff, there is a section of this road that is dangerous. You will come around a bend. There will be a lake with open water to your right. Ahead of you, you will see water flowing over the road from a rise to your left for about 100 yards. He said there's a spring in that rise that never freezes. He said stop and look for any orange sticks that will mark channels or holes in the road you will not be able to see because of the flowing water. He said plan your route. Make sure you do not go too far to the right because the terrain slopes toward the lake. And if you start to slide sideways on the ice, you won't stop until you are in the water. The lake only has a thin ice at best of times because of the spring that continuously flows." He said, once you start, he said, do not stop no matter what. Use fourth or fifth gear and keep the accelerator down until you are through this. I thanked Farley, and I began my trip at about 11 a.m. The trip to Thompson was quite beautiful. It was a very clear, cold day, and the sky was a dark blue. The highway was dry, and there was very little traffic. I stayed in Thompson overnight, parked at the Walmart to sleep, and the next morning I was up early, grabbed a double-double from Tim Hortons because I knew I wouldn't see one of them for a while. Just north of Thompson, you come to what seems like the edge of land. It seems like you can see forever. By noon, I was in Lynn Lake. I fueled up at the local Esso and headed for the entrance to the winter road. I sat there for a bit and then went about the work of chaining up the front and rear drives of my truck. And I remember sitting there looking at the road ahead of me, going over all that Farley had told me and what my own experience had taught me. I was a little apprehensive. I started off at about 2 p.m. It seemed that dusk was already starting to set in. My overnight stop was only 160 kilometers away, but at an average speed of 20 kilometers an hour, it was still an 8-hour drive. I took my time, and I enjoyed the first part of this trip. The road was narrow in spots, and I came to a few steep grades, but I was chained up and the truck was running well. As night set in, the cold and dark seemed to envelop me and my truck. I watched as the temperature continued to drop on the digital readout for the thermometer. You could feel the cold near the windows. As I approached the Lac Brochet turnoff, the digital readout read minus 49 degrees, then there was 2 dashes. It only went to minus 50. I parked for the night and did what Farley suggested I do. I parked on a flat stretch of this wide section of road, blocked my wheels, and did not set my brakes. I made myself a hot chocolate and went out and looked up at the sky. And that dark sky was full of stars like I had rarely ever seen. The northern lights were beginning to fire up. It was a beautiful night. And even with my insulated overalls and layers of sweaters and a parka, I was becoming cold. As I lay in my bunk, I could feel the cold coming off the walls. And the engine was beginning to knock noticeably because of how thick the oil was becoming. You know, for a moment I realized how very alone I was, remembering how I had met no other vehicle for 8 and a bit hours. Being that alone and knowing that there's only a little steel and insulation between you and minus 50 degrees makes one feel very small. If the engine were to quit, I knew I would get through it, but I would rather not have to prove that point. Next morning I was up around 7 a.m. and on the road again, and about 30 minutes later, just as Farley had said, when I rounded a corner at kilometer 60, I stopped. I remember looking at the water flowing over what was supposed to be a road and saying to myself, really? Imagine, if you can, sitting behind the wheel of your car looking straight ahead. The road you are on disappears into a slowly moving river of slush for just about as far as you can see. You can see where the road seems to pop back up out way in front of you. The land slopes down to the road from your left. There is a level space where you believe the road is. And then the land slopes down to your right where it meets a lake with open holes in the ice. I saw all the orange sticks poking out through the ice and what I can only describe as a flowing slush where I needed to go. It took me a good 30 minutes to get in the right mindset to tackle this. I put my truck in gear, worked it up to 5th, and held the accelerator down. I was a little over halfway across when the steering wheels felt like they broke through. And then when the drives hit the same place, the truck seemed to drop, and with a loud bang and jolt, it bounced back up again. I remember Farley saying that no matter what happens, do not stop. The trailer wheels hit the same spot, only this time it was a violent bounce. When I was through to the other side, I stopped and checked out the unit for damage, and confirming that everything was okay, and after sending a satellite message to our office asking them to advise Manitoba Highway and Infrastructure that the road may be damaged at kilometer 220, I carried on. I arrived at Dooley Lake at about 2 p.m. I delivered the new bus and loaded the old one. The people at Dooley Lake came out to meet me. I was offered food and hot coffee. I said my goodbyes and began the journey back. When I arrived at the difficult crossing, someone had already marked the new hole that I had made. I skirted around and through without any problem this time. I spent the night again at the Lac Brochet turnoff. The next morning I was up early and on the road, and about 50 kilometers from the entrance, I came to a crest of a hill. And halfway down, there was a tractor-trailer jackknifed across the road. I walked down to where he was, but there was no driver. I looked under the truck, and the drive shaft had dropped out, and there were no chains on his wheels. I went back to my truck and settled in, not knowing how long the road would be blocked for. And I sat there, and I remembered Farley saying, chain up when you are alone, and pick a gear at the bottom of the hill that will get you over the top. He said if you try and shift gears, you might just come to a complete stop and then damage your drivetrain trying to get going again on a steep incline. I had to smile a bit. About 4 hours later, 4 trucks from Manitoba Hydro caught up to me. One truck had a boom lift, so working together and by attaching all our trucks by chains, one behind each other, we were able to move the truck forward as the boom truck swung the trailer to the side of the road and opened up a path for us to get through. I arrived back to Lynn Lake about 9 p.m., and I stopped at the Esso for fuel again, and I learned that the driver of the abandoned truck was safe in town. When I went in to sign the bill, the woman said, "You didn't make bad time, given the truck blocking the road." I looked at her, and I asked politely how she knew what kind of time I had made. And she smiled at me. She said, "Well, after you fueled up and told us you were going the other night, where you were going the other night, and we knew that you were going alone, we called up to Dooley Lake and let them know you were going up on the road by yourself. So they were watching for you. And when you left Dooley Lake, they did the same. They gave us a call and let us know what time you left. And if we hadn't seen you by tomorrow morning, someone would have jumped in a pickup truck and gone looking for you." I didn't really know what to say. Learning that someone was looking out for me when I felt so alone was a bit overwhelming for a moment. Living this simple story, I understand the story of Jesus more clearly. A shepherd keeping an eye even without us knowing. Farley, a teacher setting guideposts, and myself learning to listen to what is taught. This story of a journey to me is a bit of an illustration or a snapshot of our walk through life. The message and life of Jesus the Christ sets the guideposts, gives us an idea where the solid road is when we take those challenging journeys or make those difficult crossings. And we all make challenging journeys and difficult crossings in our life where we start off into the unknown. And even when we do make a mistake or take a wrong turn, God is always there to set us back on course. We just need to be open to His voice by becoming still and listening. Today, as we journey through this uncertain time of physical and social distancing, we need to quiet ourselves and we need to listen to God. We need to look for the guideposts on this road that we are on. In what we have called this liminal space, the space between what has been and what has not yet been, we need to quiet ourselves. We need to let the shepherd lead us through this time to what can be. Most of all, We need to question the urge to return to what we call normal. If we watch and listen to what is going on in this world, we can't help but realize that we have created a system that does not serve humanity, but a system that humanity serves. Over the past week or so, we have watched people become impatient, wanting things to get back to normal. And this was driven home when we hear from some that we need to get back to normal regardless of the human cost. The reasons our economy will be ruined. It may take so long to recover. The cost of protecting the vulnerable may be too high. As a society, as a people that claim to be Christians, we need to listen and wonder what the shepherd would say to this. Where do the guideposts lead us? If we are patient, if we listen, we can transform the system we have created to be more just, one to look after the poor, one that makes sure our elderly are looked after properly. Create a society that cares for everyone, a system that serves the well-being of every individual, not every individual serving the system. We need to follow the Good Shepherd. Thank you.